The Trump shooter, Thomas Crooks, thought Lee Harvey Oswald was a lone gunman. Where would he get such an idea? Let's consider the mimesis of Gerald Posner today on Gracearchy. Our world is lost in unnecessary fear and hurt. Our systems seem scientifically engineered to make you small, powerless, and always waiting for the next great leader who will fix the problems around us. Worse, we're witnessing neighbor versus neighbor while warfare breaks out around our family tables. But you have access to a spirit, a strength that enlarges and empowers you. Even better, you don't need to wait for the next big movement. You can heal the world. It's time for governance by grace. Welcome to Gracearchy with Jim Babka. Before we get to our very unusual show today, I want to say right up front that we're sponsored by the Zero Aggression Project, zeroaggressionproject.org. If you're not signed up to get the email that comes from Zero Aggression Project, please do that right now. And whatever platform you're using to consume this conversation, please know that when you click to get notifications about our new releases, you're also improving our position in the algorithm. That action doesn't just help you, it helps more people like you notice and watch this too. So go ahead right now, just click it. Jefferson Morley, with an organization called JFK Facts, notes that, and I'm going to quote, when Gerald Posner and the New York Times reference JFK, they actually encourage baseless Trump conspiracy theories. Get that? They encourage Trump conspiracy theories. Now, Jim reviewed Posner's column in the New York Times, which I believe was from the 23rd, and he thinks that the problem might be even worse than that. Thomas Crooks thought that Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone gunman because the day after Posner's piece appeared in the New York Times, the FBI Director Christopher Wray testified to Congress. There, he announced that Thomas Crooks, who presumably shot Donald Trump in the ear at a Pennsylvania rally, had researched the distance from Oswald's alleged sixth-floor perch to JFK's limo. Now, let's start with this. We're going to take a very specific dive today into several topics, but JFK figures prominently in them. So let's go back to that sixth-floor window in the Texas Book Depository. And Thomas Crooks doing some online research, trying to figure out how far it was from there to the JFK limo. How far was it, Jim?
It's about 60 yards. It's not very long.
It's not very far.
So that makes it seem like a doable shot. If I were to be more specific, the guesstimate is at about 175 feet for the first shot that hit, and about 270 feet for the second shot that hit. Okay,
we've got some video on this later, so those are your numbers.
So I it would have persuaded Thomas Crooks that the distance was doable. Yes.
He could take the shot. Stationary target. Anyway, yes. So as I understand it, let's get into this. Three things converge to bring us to this episode today. First, Thomas Crooks. He shoots at former President Donald Trump on 7/13. Second, Gerald Posner and a guy named Mark Zaid in the New York Times wrote an editorial from the 23rd, 10 days later, arguing that people should still believe this so-called official story of JFK's assassination. Just trust it. The next day, on the 24th, and the third thing, FBI Director Christopher Wray testifies that Thomas Crooks registered for the Trump event on 7/6, and on that same day, searched online to learn the distance from Oswald to Kennedy, right?
Yeah. So I want to say right up front that I was largely inspired to go ahead and come out and begin discussing what I've been researching because of Jeff Morley's article. He had pointed something out, and I'm reading it literally at the same time that this Ray news about the research, which included some information about a drone that Crooks allegedly flew over the site as well. I realized there was a connection between these two things, and it's the thing I most want to discuss. So I'm not going to say much about Mr. Zaid, who is the co-author of this piece. He's younger. Maybe Posner has him as a successor of some sort. He's very well connected. And when I say connected, I mean like probably a made man inside the intelligence community. And that's all I want.
You used the word spook earlier about
yeah,
Posner,
I want to, in public here, I want to avoid getting too much, and he's a lawyer, and I want to avoid too much in getting into who he is.
Yeah.
I have some definite opinions. I did some research. He's definitely on Team Deep State. So but Posner's a different kettle of fish. Posner's an attorney. And Posner is the official court historian. He is the living historian. There's been a couple other people along the way that carried what was called the official story, which means the government version of events that were set and established in 1964. The assassination happens on November 22nd, 1963. And Posner writes a book. And this is the book. It's called Case Closed. And it is the definitive, this is the paperback version. You can get a sense of how big it is. This is the definitive official version that was endorsed by no less than a member of the Warren Commission, Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford, after this book was published, would no longer take a single question about this. His answer would always be to go read this book. Okay. We're not going to get into it today in the interest of time. There's been more government research on this question and government official pronouncements on this question. So the idea that we have to keep going back and taking this outdated rush to judgment job that was done by the Warren Commission in 1964 and treat it like it's the official final statement and the case is closed is just not accurate or right. We're not going to be able to get into all of it. But here's what I want to say about this book, because I think it's very, very important to understand where Gerald Posner comes from and what it is that he's doing. Gerald Posner is an attorney writing a prosecutor's brief. He is not trying to get at the truth. He is trying to sell the prosecution's case. This is an early 90s kind of thing where he is basically coming back, 25 years after the event, right? And he's beginning to say, hey, the story still holds up, and we've learned a couple of new things that allow us to say that the story still holds up. And I'm going to incorporate those things and kind of give you a Warren Commission, circa 1990, basically. And he keeps getting called upon to comment on these events again and again and again as an expert, despite the fact that he leaves out a significant amount of information. I am a tad bit offended by this book, and the reason is because most people are reading it, and it's treated by outfits like the New York Times as if it is a complete recapping of the case. But at the very beginning of the book, a substantial portion of the book, the first 80 pages or so, or 100 pages or so, are a commentary or a review of the life of Lee Harvey Oswald and the difficult childhood he had. And when you come away from it, you are completely convinced this dude must have been a nut job. He must have been a loner. His mother drove him to it. And I'm not saying that that's immaterial to the case, to be clear. I'm not saying that somebody shouldn't have reviewed and written this material. I'm just saying that that's exactly how a prosecutor putting somebody up on a stand and wanting to tear them apart would go about doing their job. He's establishing motive right from the very get-go. And so that is the proper way. Just objectively speaking, the proper way to read this book is as a prosecutor's manual.
So with that as the context, can I get your response to a quote from the editorial op-ed on the 23rd?
Yeah, let's get into it.
So Posner and Zaid again. So here's the quote. It's a little bit long. Bear with me. We saw, following the Kennedy and King murders, that many people had difficulty accepting that a single, troubled, otherwise inconsequential person could change history. A conspiracy theory did that very nicely. If President Kennedy was killed because a secret cabal had to stop him from withdrawing from Vietnam, or because he wanted to upend the Central Intelligence Agency, it gave some meaning to his death. It is not as if he died for no reason at the hands of a single unbalanced assassin. What's your response?
I want to say four things. First, I understand the assertion that he's attempting to make here. When I was 10 years old, my mother was killed in a car accident on Mother's Day weekend. And at 10 years old, my natural instinct was to take events that occurred in the days and months that followed, and maybe even one significant event that occurs in the fact that I wouldn't have met my wife if that event hadn't happened, and said, these are the meanings of this. So I think this is a very human need. It's part of the bargaining that we do in the grief process. But it is a grief process. And we've had plenty of time since then. And, anybody that's still crying tears over the death of John Kennedy, that it wasn't directly related to him, it'd be okay, for example, for his daughter to do it, who's still alive. Gosh, I'm not buying it. And it turns out, number two, that it's an insult that's scientifically untrue. And what do I mean by that? I mean that I have met and talked with and rubbed elbows with people in this field who have spent an inordinate amount of time researching and trying to get at the truth. And some of their theories are wacky. In some cases, I'm not going to dispute that. There is a ton of nonsense in the field, just a ton of it. But there are everybody I've met is sincere and or appears to be. And I've met some incredible people in these discussions. So I just don't find that they're trying to find meaning and that they're applying some kind of definition. They actually are very earnest and sincere people. The people that are doing this seriously enough to write the books and present at public events and do shows about this. There's a seriousness to it that is pretty immense. I'm not saying that, again, that there's not some sloppiness, that there's not some craziness that shows up in some of this, but there is actual real research going on. And
like above what Posner's position as the state historian might be.
Yes, exactly. Yes. And in fact, there are things that Posner only knows now. And this is one of my beefs here. This is why I felt like it was time to come out and start talking. One of my beefs here is that he should know better. And I'm saying this in to the sense that there's been other things that have developed that he's well aware of and that he's been consulted on nationally by reputable sources, and it's due to conspiracy theorists that we know everything that we know about the case today. They have changed the shape of what it is that we know about that event. They have made it so that the House came back and reviewed this. There was an Assassinations Record Review Board. There are committees and commissions along the way. There are various different types of scientific investigation that have been done to that event. There's 3D modeling that's been done. There is a ton of declassification that has been done. And all of that is because of the intense work of a group of people that we call researchers. And I'm going to say something that I've learned through this experience that I've not heard anyone else say or explain. This is incredibly important. I am not a researcher. And I'm not going to portray myself as one. Researchers spend time digging through clues. They go to an archive and they read everything that's in the archive, or they read every bit of a report, or they do an autopsy, or they delve into something, and they have to start collecting stuff and pulling it all together from various sources. It's nitty-gritty, hard work. What I have found is that repeatedly these researchers are not excellent communicators. And it turns out, Bill, that there is a difference between researching and communicating. There are popularizers, there are communicators, and I would very much put myself more on that side. I like to take information that's given to me there where people have done the hard work, and it is incredibly hard work. It's slavish work, and then take it and synthesize it in a way that it can be presented. I will tell you that one of the big problems, one of the big issues is that people the researchers do a really crappy job in some cases of presenting their own case. Right? They don't know how to, kind of organize the argument, what's important and what's not. And they don't know how to keep it so that the cookies are on the lowest shelf so that someone new to it can follow along. They don't understand how to do that stuff. And so what I'm sharing, anything that I share here today is a synthesis thing. And I'm nowhere near steeped enough. I don't have time to do what they've done. I've got a full-time job, this podcast, and some other things in my life. But the point I want to make today, the main thing I want to say in answer to your question, is that we have talked repeatedly about the importance of mimesis, the imitation, the rivalry that begins to occur between persons where one person duplicates. This is how people learn. People learn through imitation. And you know what? If you tell me, and I'm not the least bit surprised, that in the Google search of Matthew Crooks, that he researched the distance between Oswald and Kennedy, you're telling me that the lone nut believed in Posner's lone nut theory. And I'm going to go so far as to suggest that this essentially enables him. This essentially gives him confidence. He too can become a significant man in history. So it's not the case that the rest of us sitting out here who are questioning the quote unquote official version are in some steep psychological need to have a story that explains things. We actually are dealing in facts and evidence. We're asking hard questions, as you will see. It is the Posners of the world. It is the Michael Shermers of the world who are coming out and saying to people, oh, you have this psychological need. And it turned out that the psychology that was enabled was probably Mr. Crooks. That's who got enabled by their version of the story.
So Michael Shermer?
Michael Shermer is the publisher of Skeptic Magazine. And
Gotcha.
basically, you know, anytime somebody in science stands up or anybody in official position stands up and says something, he says, listen to the experts. The experts know what they're talking about. But see, this is the problem. There are experts in this field all over the place. We just lost one a couple of months ago in Cyril Wecht, who was, to my mind, one of the two most prominent autopsy examiners. This guy's a forensic pathologist with, you know, thousands and thousands of cases under his belt. And he just passed away. He's in his 90s earlier this year. And, you know, this is an expert. So
I wanted to make sure we caught all four of your points.
That I understand the search for meaning, that it's scientifically untrue to say, it's an insult, that's scientifically untrue to say that these people had some psychological need to do their research, that it's due to the fact of these conspiracy theorists that we know much of what we know, and Posner should know better because he keeps getting this information, things keep coming up over the years because of the work of these researchers, and finally that it was that if there's any psychological inference coming from any direction, if there was any psychological need to believe something, Posner is one of the people that helped supply it to a man who took a shot at the former president of the United States.
I'm with you. Okay, so more from Posner and Zaid. And I'm going to quote again from their column. Maybe I should call it an op-ed.
Mm-hmm.
Quote, until this week, the column was released on Tuesday, July 23rd, there had not been a single news conference by the Secret Service Department or the Department of Homeland Security. No release of files that might show the preparations for securing vulnerable locations from which an assassin might strike. So, neither the public nor Congress learned much more when Kimberly Cheetle, the director of the Secret Service, appeared before a congressional committee on Monday. There was outrage from both Democrats and Republicans at her repeated refusal to answer specific questions about the security failures that contributed to the shooting. Now, this silence looked particularly bad, given news reports initially denied by the government that top Secret Service officials over a 2-year span rejected repeated requests for more agents and magnetometers at Mr. Trump's large public events, as well as declined to provide extra snipers for outdoor venues. This seems like do I want to say dereliction of duty? It doesn't seem reasonable to me, Jim, that we would fail to protect a former president.
No, there are a lot of problems. We're still in the early days. So as we're recording this, we haven't yet exited July of 2024. There are manifest problems apparent holes at a minimum in the security that was provided to Donald Trump that day. But Posner's comparison here ends up being ahistorical. So first, I just want to say in 1963, there was, as Mark Lane called it, a rush to judgment. Mark Lane was probably the earliest assassination researcher. He basically decided to act as the attorney. He was hired for a short time, but continued to do the work even after he was no longer retained by Lee Harvey Oswald's mother to basically represent Oswald. And he ended up putting up a documentary called Rush to Judgment. And it described really the behavior. And we know a lot more about the fact that that's what happened, given various declassifications that have occurred over the last now just over 30 years. So there was a rush to judgment. And here's the thing. Posner knows this. The day after the assassination in 1963, J. Edgar Hoover announced that the focus of the investigation, he announced this to his entire FBI, was going to be narrowed to Oswald. So the assassination happens at 12:30 on a Friday afternoon, and by the next morning, on a Saturday, because it was all hands on deck the day before. He basically stops that and says, now we only want information that focuses on Oswald. This happens the day after. We now know this. 3 days after John F. Kennedy's murder, and just a day after Lee Harvey Oswald was shot, Deputy Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach wrote a memo that basically is the sperm that impregnated Johnson's mind that would lead to the creation of the Warren Commission just 4 days after that. Johnson wasn't initially planning on going this direction, but there was a campaign from inside his administration and just outside immediate allies to get him to make this a federal review and create what they call a blue ribbon commission. And then that commission never considered the possibility that anyone other than Oswald was involved, nor that there were more than 3 shots fired. One of their lawyers, a future U.S. Senator by the name of Arlen Specter, invented the improbable single bullet theory, and only did this in the spring of 1964 when they were compelled to admit that one of the shots had missed. We'll get to that in a little bit later about that shot. But I want to say that even in the quote that you just read, there is something of a point that they actually are making, and that I do agree with, and that is that the government keeps secrets routinely from its people, and they claim to be doing it for our own good. The American people had not seen the Zapruder film in 1964. In these early days, it was kept under lock and only revealed in March of 75 by Robert Grodin and comedian Dick Gregory on Geraldo Rivera's Goodnight America. And most people watching even this show right now have not actually seen the Nix film, which shoots from the opposite side of where Zapruder is. In fact, Zapruder shows up in that film, in that 6 seconds of film. And his grandchildren have been, since 2015, suing the government to get the original version of that film back. It was promised back, and it was never delivered. There were subsidiary parts of that film delivered back, byproducts of it, but the actual film, the original film itself, which today could go through a whole bunch of testing now that we have a whole bunch of much better video editing tools, higher resolution, AI. There's a number of different things that could be done with this video now, but the government has been fighting. They have not admitted that whether they have or don't have it, and they've been fighting the Nix grandchildren now about giving it back. It's 2015. We're talking about 9 years now.
You make a really interesting point here, which is how far along all of what we know has advanced since the day of. And I'd like to say for everybody who's listening to this right now that this is not the only episode you're going to hear from Jim on the JFK assassination.
Well, let's not promise too much yet.
I'm not going to promise you anything. It's taken a few years to get to this point, and I just want you to know that there's a need right now to get behind the curtain on all of this.
Yeah, we did in December 3 episodes on conspiracy.
Yep, the conspiracy theory setup.
And that was to lay out kind of how to analyze conspiracy theories. This was one of the ones we had in mind. It's not the only one, but it's one of the ones that we had in mind. We said that, a lot of conspiracy theories are fake, right? Or there were problems with them. We went through a whole taxonomy in the very first installment of that. So we'll include those episodes in the show notes for people to go back and reference. And we may, maybe even start to specialize in on how to do this. People can start to watch me, see if I practiced what I preached in those December episodes. But so yeah, I mean, I want to say more about this as time permits. This is a very intensive topic, and there are experts all over the place out there and there are people who think they're experts who have their opinions as well, who will show up in the comments section invariably to tell me what I'm right or wrong about. And they may be right and they may be wrong. So yeah, we'll see how that goes.
Let's take a little more from Posner and Zaid because it's directly related to this conspiracy theory idea. And I'll summarize, I won't quote, but conspiracy theorists. So conspiracy theorists have their own versions of the truth. I think we've covered that pretty well back in December. In the early days following the Kennedy assassination, it was often said the greatest marksman in the world tried and failed to repeat what the government said Lee Harvey Oswald had done. Fire 3 shots at a moving target in a very short amount of time. Now, here's where I want to quote back from Posner's actual op-ed. But it turned out that Mr. Oswald had plenty of time to get the shots off, and what he did has been replicated numerous times.
Okay.
Come on, man. This is 2024, Mr.
In
Posner.
the early days are the words that jumped out at me the most. And I'm going to be Jefferson Morley, picked on him for this, and I'm going to do the same. It's just not true that in the early days that there was that there were people beginning to say, oh, he couldn't have gotten off that many shots with that rifle. That was not happening. I'm going to tell you what did happen, and then you can judge for yourself. The same month that the country saw the Zapruder film, which is, again, 1975. So you tell me if a few days is 1963 to 1975. The entire country got an encore performance. So the way this works is in early March, the film gets played for the American public. The show causes a huge uproar. Lots of people missed it because they didn't have DVRs or even VCRs at that juncture. So they replayed the Zapruder film and brought in more people to bring commentary and explanation from both sides of this issue in a March 27th, 1975 episode. One of the people that was in this episode was Josiah Thompson. His friends call him Tink. Josiah Thompson. He had written a book called 6 Seconds in Dallas. He had enjoyed access to the Zapruder film. He went out and interviewed hundreds of witnesses. And here's the thing that stuns just the heck out of me. He interviewed more people than the Warren Commission did. Millions of Americans watched as he illustrated on Geraldo's show that night why the single bullet theory is more accurately called the magic bullet. Now, I am bringing up Thompson and his book 6 Seconds because it wasn't days after the Kennedy assassination. And Posner knows this. It wasn't even months after the Kennedy assassination. Thompson's book came out in 1967. Bill, that's years later. That's years later. Okay. So I want to play a clip from that appearance on March 27th, 1975 on Goodnight America with Geraldo Rivera. This is Josiah Tink Thompson.
Harvey Oswald had been using a machine gun. He could have done that easily, but he wasn't using a machine gun. He was using this carbine. Notice how it works. Now, the FBI tested this gun. They got Agent Robert Frazier, the fastest gun they could find, and he fired many, many rounds from this rifle. And what they wanted to find out was, what was the minimum mechanical time necessary to pull the trigger, work the action, and pull the trigger again, without aiming. I stress that, without aiming. The fastest time in all these tests that Bob Frazier could manage was 2.3 seconds.
Okay. That's 2.3 seconds between. That's the fastest time for being able to shoot, reload with that bolt action rifle. Okay? So the fact that Thompson, this is history now I'm bringing to you, that Posner knows.
Yep.
The fact that Thompson,
we've all seen it.
The fact that Thompson had written this book in 1967 made this an issue, and it caused a stir. And the stir got big enough that none other than Walter Cronkite, with the assistance of Dan Rather, ran an episode about the Warren Commission and did the best, and I'm telling you the best to that point, because even the Warren Commission didn't go to the lengths that you're about to see here in this next clip, did the best experiment to see if the shots were possible. So I want to play that clip, which is going to go a little longer than the typical clip.
News decided to conduct its own tests with the mimetically Carcano.
A moving target is harder to hit than a stationary one, and the elevation of the 6th floor window might make a difference. The only elevation for the Warren Commission firing tests was a 30-foot tower, less than half the height of the book depository's 6th floor above Elm Street. So CBS News had a tower and target track constructed to match exactly the heights and distances in Dealey Plaza. The target track was angled to match precisely the angle of Elm Street. The target, a standard FBI silhouette, moved by electric motor at 11 miles an hour. approximately the speed of the presidential limousine. A rifle of the same make and age as Oswald's was fitted with the same 4-power telescopic sight found on his rifle. 11 volunteer marksmen took turns, firing clips of 3 bullets each at the moving target. None of the men had much familiarity with the Italian manico carcano, although each was given time to practice at a nearby indoor range, and most of the volunteers were experienced with bolt-action rifles. In each case, the first shot was fired at a point approximating the point at which the Warren Commission deduced the first shot was fired. Distance, about 175 feet. In 6 seconds, the distance grows to 270 feet. Results varied. A Maryland state trooper made 2 hits in the silhouette. 1 near miss in slightly less than 5 seconds. Another state trooper's best time was 5.4 seconds. One hit, 2 near misses. A weapons engineer had the best score. Three hits in 5.2 seconds.
Remember the weapons engineer. We'll get back to him in just a moment. I have a slight rabbit trail I'd like to go down with you here, Bill.
Sure.
This is a bonus just for you. We enjoy being able to play that under a doctrine called fair use in the copyright law. One of the people that helped open fair use was Tink Thompson.
No kidding.
In the book that he wrote, that we are discussing right now, 6 Seconds, they did not have access to the Zapruder film. They were not allowed to use it. It was owned by Time Life at that time. And so it was under copyright. We couldn't use it. So he had sketches made of stills, and Time Life sued him. In fact, the lawsuit dragged on for long enough that he says he basically didn't make any money. Even though the book was a bestseller, he basically gave a lot of his royalties back to defending the book. But they sued him for the Zapruder sketches. They lost, and we have fair use. It helped expand the fair use understanding that we're operating under today. So thank you, Tink, not just for this information that we've got, but also for the ability to share this. Everybody should be thankful for him. That's not the only irony in this story, by the way. All right. That setup was 11 men. They don't disclose this, but we now know that 11 men tried that experiment. They were selected for their marksmanship ability.
So they were experts. They could shoot.
They were given 3 tries each at that track. The track that they set up worked from a stopped start, a convenience, obviously, that Lee Harvey Oswald did not have. And the commission report indicates, the Warren Commission report indicates that the scope was off. It was not properly aligned on the day of November 22nd, 1963. Now, I'm pleased that they were honest about this, because they include in the evidence of the case not 1, but 3 shims that they put in to do their own ballistic testing. Let me explain this one more time so that nobody misunderstands what I'm saying. The scope's off. They need to test the rifle to see how it works and how it may have been used that day. And to achieve the result with the scope, to manage to have some form of accuracy, they had to put 3 shims, basically something underneath it to move it so that it's in the right position. And because they did that, they needed to document the fact that they did that. And each of these 3 shims has an evidence number in the Warren Commission evidence package. And contrary to what Posner is saying, and what your own lying eyes can see, CBS actually demonstrates that Oswald's alleged feat was really not replicable. Like, he didn't do it. Like, that's not what they're showing there. Like, they conclude that he must have been able to do it because one guy could hit 3 times. They conclude there were 4 out of the 11 that got 2 shots, regardless of time, and only 1 who got all 3. And the one who got all 3, that weapons engineer that they referenced at the end, his name is Howard Donahue, and he went on to become an assassination researcher too. He too did not agree with the official story. I don't agree with everything that Mr. Donahue came up with. In fact, one of the things he came up with, I believe to be positively kooky. However, Donahue, like Thompson, believes only 2 shots were fired from the 6th floor. There are 2 different theories floating around out there about bullet casings. The government presently has an evidence from that 6th floor that day found at the scene that would lead one to believe that only 2 of them were fired that day. And Donahue has one of those theories. He is one of the proprietors of a theory on that. And he basically would say that it was I can't think of the word, but it was kept in the weapon so that the space was kept clear and clean. Donahue also believed in the magic bullet theory. He believed in Arlen Specter's idea that one shot went through the president and through Governor Conley.
And then circled back and hit the president again in the forehead.
No one's quite claiming it's that magical. But it was his belief in this thing that led him to another valid insight. Even though I don't agree with the single bullet, it led to another valid insight. And that was that the first bullet was a full metal jacket and the second bullet was frangible. Now, I'm no firearms expert, and I know that every time you get into a gun discussion, there's vocabulary that needs to be used to be precise, and it's really easy to run astray. And I will say up front, I'm going to just apologize up front if I explain any of this incorrectly. And I will even validate any comments that are left below that actually correct something that I'm about to say on YouTube or even Rumble. I'll do it there too. So a frangible bullet, when it hits its target, is designed to immediately break. And it creates a field of damage because all the fragments go into the object and spread apart, and they do a lot of damage. And so if you shoot center mass of a human being, a frangible bullet will go in, but it's very unlikely to come out. All the parts of it will disperse inside, maximizing the internal damage of the person.
I see where you're going here.
The full metal jacket is typically what we use in war. It's also typically what's used in target practice. It is less expensive. And in war, because of the laws of war, we're not interested in destroying the human being that we're headed. We're interested in pulling the enemy off the battlefield. So a shot will do. If a shot goes through a human being, there's enough damage there that they're coming off the battlefield. And it works like dodgeball in that way. But it's even better than that, because if we have a high-powered, full metal jacket, it might go through and hit a second person if we're fortunate enough. Maybe it hits 2 people. So it would take 2 people off the battlefield in that way. So my point is that the full metal jacket goes all the way through, and the frangible bullet does not, and it increases damage inside. The one argument that the magic bullet theory has going for it is that it goes through the president into Conley. And so that bullet is likely to be a full metal jacket bullet. But the other bullet, the one that comes and hits the president in the head and is ultimately the kill shot, blows his head up. And that's evident on Zapruder film frame 313. You can already see a flap coming up on the head. Witnesses described brain matter coming out the side. Jackie Kennedy crawls out in the back to get a piece of the president's head. Bobby Hargis, who is riding in the motorcycle on the left rear side of the limousine, reports being covered in blood. This is an explosion of a piece of anatomy that is more likely to have occurred as a result of a frangible bullet. Now, to be clear, Thompson has his own theory of the final headshot that requires 2 impacts or 2 shots. And I'm still working through what happened there. I don't want to get too deep into the weeds on this here today. But the point that I was trying to make in all of this is that we're still dealing with the early days, and Posner manages to ignore something.
A ton of new evidence, if I can quote you.
Instead of the early days, there was considerable testimony by immediate and credible witnesses at the scene that cast doubt on whether the fatal headshot came from behind. I'm going to offer this evidence to you without commentary today. I am not going to suggest I agree or disagree with it. I'm not prepared to say that. But I am going to say that Mr. Posner gave you a false issue of how people were handling things that I've just walked you through what actually happened historically, and then ignores what I'm about to say here. Within hours of the shooting, Merriman Smith, the United Press International reporter, UPI back then, reported, it was in the presidential motorcade, and he reported, here I quote, "Some of the Secret Service agents thought the gunfire was from an automatic weapon fired to the right rear of the president's car, probably from a grassy knoll to which the police rushed." The Nix film that I mentioned earlier shows, like, it cuts off and then starts back up again. You see a mass of humanity, dozens of people running to the grassy knoll. Some researchers have attempted to quantify the number of shots based on earshot testimony, and I thank Marshall Evans for compiling the information I'm going to share. I'm only going to share a snapshot of it right now. Tink Thompson interviewed 109 witnesses that were there that day. Regarding the origin, 64 responded. So where did the shots come from? 42% said the Texas School Book Depository. 55% said the knoll. Stuart Gallinor collected information from 216 witnesses about the origins, and 83% answered where they thought the shots came from. 46% pointed to the Texas School Book Depository, while 46% said the knoll. TV coverage that very day, included several witnesses who stated their belief that the shots came from the grassy knoll. Now, my very favorite of these witnesses is a guy, and I wanted, if we had time, we don't, to play S.M. Holland. S.M. Holland was one of a group of people who basically was the guard up on the bridge. He worked for the railroad. He was already an older man by this point, advanced in age, not old, but older, like we are, Bill. And where he was on the bridge, on the overpass, where the president was going to drive immediately under, and did after having been shot. And he repeated the same testimony for years and years and years, and he was solid as a stone. One of the things that makes this story hard to research is that there are people who, under pressure or desire to conform or lack of faith in their own initial estimate of what happened, changed their stories along the way. S.M. Holland never did. And he saw smoke emerging from where the fence line was on the grassy knoll, right next to where the motorcade was. And he believed a shot came from there. He was convinced of it until the day he died. And in summary, Jeff Morley notes that this analysis ignores all the reporting at the time of the spectators at the scene, and the fact that even behind the scenes, the CIA and the FBI were asking different questions about where those shots came from, the numbers that came from, down at the grassroots of those organizations. Now, the New York Times, who published Posner's piece, with one exception, last year, has always stuck with this official story that Posner's trying to sell right now. The only time they've broken from it happened last fall. And every other time, the assassination was on November 22nd, 1963, into 1964. Okay, I'm taking you back in time again. Into 1964, the FBI reported and the New York Times served as stenographers rather than reporters for 3 separate shots hitting the motorcade. I promised we were going to get to the one that missed. Here we go. James Tague was standing in front of the railroad bridge that day. He was on the Main Street portion of it. So it's called the Triple Underpass. So he's basically, he's on the other side of Main Street, as I understand it, but he's on the side of the bridge where you can watch the motorcade go by. His car got stopped on Commerce Street. He couldn't get any further. So he got out of the car and he stood there to see what was going on and ended up watching the parade. He was the 3rd person wounded that day. I'm going to use Morley's explanation. Quote, when the wounding of the bystander James Tague was unexpectedly made public in the spring of 1964, the Warren Commission and major news organizations had to change their story to sustain the government's wobbly account of the crime. So the assassination, I just want to make sure everybody's clear on the timeline, happens on November 22nd, 1963. It's basically Thanksgiving, 1963. Go around the calendar now. We are in spring of 1964. before they are forced to admit, because Tague wouldn't go anywhere. He had been interviewed on television. People knew that he had a cut, a scrape on his face from a ricocheted bullet that missed the motorcade. And so they turned to Arlen Specter. They're already well down the tracks in this investigation, and they will issue their report just a few months later. Commission lawyer Arlen Specter came up with the only plausible explanation that would account for all of the wounds inflicted by just 3 bullets. The even more improbable, what they call single bullet theory, which continues to this day to be endorsed by credulous news organizations. And here's the point, as Jefferson Morley observes it, and that is what Posner and Zaid are saying, early days. What they really mean here is early years, not early days. And that's being generous, right? It's at least about 4 years that go by. With the 6 Seconds in Dallas publication and the fact that it became enough of a seller that even CBS News felt they had to correct the public record. They had to basically put the genie back in the bottle.
Let's roll back to a little bit more of what Posner's piece said. And this is a focus on conspiracy now. I'll quote, "Many people had difficulty accepting that a single, troubled, otherwise inconsequential person could change history. A conspiracy theory did that very nicely. If President Kennedy was killed because of a secret cabal, had to stop him from withdrawing from Vietnam, or because he wanted to upend the Central Intelligence Agency, it gave some meaning to his death."
I like Morley's response here too, and I'm borrowing heavily from it and repeating back to you. I want to make a handful of points really quickly, though. Declassified Pentagon records discovered by the Assassination Record Review Board in 1997. That was one of the official government commissions or committees that looked into the assassination. To my mind, the best of them. Showed that the Joint Chiefs of Staff approved a plan in 1963. We will not get into this plan. There's lots of people watching that are going to know exactly what I'm referring to. But it was to stage a spectacular, violent incident on U.S. soil and use, quote, only the most trusted covert personnel, end quote, to arrange to place the blame on Cuba. I just described a false flag event.
Yep.
By the Joint Chiefs of Staff presented to Kennedy. In 2001, it was revealed that the anti-Castro student group that linked Oswald to Cuba within the hours of JFK's assassination. And this is a whole New Orleans story component to this entire saga. But they tied him to this anti-Castro group, and the student group that was involved in that was being funded by the CIA to the tune of $51,000 a month.
That's some real money in 1960.
Yeah, I should have done the inflation-based calculations. That's 1963, $51,000. The CIA did not think Oswald was inconsequential either. That's a myth. Top CIA officials voiced this lie on the American public in May of 1964, when Deputy Director Richard Helms told the Warren Commission under oath that the agency only had, quote, minimal information about Oswald before JFK was killed.
They were in bed with him for years.
The counterintelligence chief, James Angleton, had monitored Oswald's movement, politics, and personal life constantly from November 59 to November 1963. They had done so in part because he had gone to the Soviet Union. The story we're not going to get into today either, but they had been keeping careful tabs on him. And that was just not true that they had only minimal information. Counterintelligence is the part where it's spy versus spy. This is where they're trying to figure out where leaks are happening and information's getting back out of the CIA. That's where Angleton worked. He was the counterintelligence chief, and they had been monitoring Oswald. He personally, it was going all the way to the top. There was a special file for this purpose. They were flagging it in a unique way so that it was making it to his office as part of the analysis. The CIA even intercepted, opened, and copied his mail from 1959 to 1962, and we didn't know about that until 1 year ago. That was revealed in July of 2023. And the reason we didn't know is that the person who was reading his mail was still alive. So we had to wait for that person to pass. And now we can't, of course, interview him and ask him what he was doing, when he was asked, who he was asked, and why. We can't go through all that. All that's lost. But in July of last year, we were finally allowed to have that information because he passed from the scene.
So I've just got to ask here. Are Posner and Zaid implying that you're gullible if you believe Kennedy was killed by his enemies instead of some random loner?
Okay, well, we'll do this in rapid fire here because former President Harry Truman responded a month later with a column calling for the abolition of the CIA. He made sure his column was dated December in I believe it was the New York Times or Washington Post. I don't remember which one, but it was dated December 22nd, exactly 1 month to the day from the assassination. That's hardly a vote of confidence for the Lone Gunmen, is it? In September 1964, Senator Richard Russell, who was a member of the Warren Commission, dissented, and they had to acknowledge that not all members of the commission believed in the single bullet theory on which the Lone Gunmen theory relies.
Yep.
In April 1967, Lyndon Baines Johnson allegedly told an aide that he thought the CIA was involved. And in JFK's closest confidant, which is his brother Robert, suspected renegade CIA officers and or organized crime figures. In fact, there were at least 4 conversations we're aware of that happened in that week. One of happened that very day of the assassination, where he revealed his thoughts privately to other individuals. These are documented events. The guy he revealed it to on the day of the assassination was the new appointee that his brother had placed as the head of the CIA. As Jefferson Morley goes on to point out, he says, RFK wasn't alone. There were geopolitical rivals like Charles de Gaulle and Fidel Castro who said out loud that it was probably rogue elements in intelligence who were involved in assassination operations. So I don't know. Are we going to say Truman, Senator Russell, LBJ, Robert Kennedy, Charles de Gaulle, Fidel Castro? Does this a gullible list? Let me give you one more.
Well, Jim, those were the early days. Remember, those were the early days.
Jackie Kennedy wasn't buying it either.
Good for her, as someone who ought to know.
So I one of the things that I think I am different in how I look at this case is that Jefferson Morley is a good old-fashioned liberal. And he wants these left liberal institutions to work. So he wants the media to be honest and act as the an additional state that checks and balances the government and gives citizens the ability to participate on an educated and informed basis in their democracy. And he's worried about the credibility of government institutions and so forth. So, there's a degree of like hopefulness on his part that all these institutions can magically somehow work. And then you find a lot of that, by the way, because a lot of these people are actually John Kennedy fans. They've placed a lot of their visions and hopes and dreams on him. I'm not burdened by that. I don't believe that the establishment media can be trusted. We've talked about that a ton on this show. I don't believe that the state can be trusted. We've talked about that an immense amount on this show. I think that incompetence may explain a lot of things, but there are plots and some of them are sinister. So I don't feel, I actually feel that somebody who believes that these institutions did their job that day and that they work very, very well. I mean, like Gerald Posner wrote a book, Case Gullible. Closed.
Sorry. Yes.
Yes.
So can we get back to the assassination attempt on Trump for just a second, Thomas Crooks?
Sure.
Which is in a way an illustration of mimetic theory, of mimesis right there. Probably incorrectly, but hey, mimesis works, right? So Posner and Zaid themselves are gullible to mimetic theory here, because what do they want? Their answer to everything is to suggest another independent commission, right? And Morley seems to want that too. What do you think, Jim?
You mean like the Warren Commission?